we are Revelation chapter 3, as far as the letter to the church in Philadelphia, as we're going through the 7 letters of the 7 churches. And there wasn't a whole lot to see in Philadelphia. There's kind of some interesting history behind the city connected to what we see written in Scripture in this letter. But to a lot of scholars, this is the most surprising city to receive a letter, because this is really, out of all of the cities in Asia Minor, this is the most insignificant city of the 7. And it really wasn't an important city. All of the others were. All the others were big. They were trade centers. They were port cities. They were something that made them very important. But when it came to Philadelphia, it really was pretty insignificant. Never was. And a really important city, either to the Romans or anybody else that came before them. So even though this was not one of the largest churches, it was notable because of its faith. And the only way we know that is because of the little bit that's written here in this letter in Revelation 3, begins in verse 7. And we're going to look at parts of this as we go through tonight. But I think Philadelphia is a great model of really what Christ wanted all of his churches to aspire to. And it's not that they didn't have the persecution. It's not that they didn't have some of the same struggles that the other churches had. But there was just something about this church that made them pretty remarkable. The letter to the church in Philadelphia, it's unique in that it does not contain any reproaches. Smyrna is the only other one. Smyrna and Philadelphia are the only 2 of these letters that Jesus doesn't have some kind of an admonition. All of the letters have Jesus expressing the things that he sees them doing, the things that he is concerned about within. He gives many of them warnings. But with Philadelphia, we don't have the warnings, not the same way, and we don't have a reproach, that something negative that is going on in the church. And so when you see here in Revelation 3 and verse 8, Jesus says, "I know your deeds. Behold, I have put before you an open door which no one can shut, because you have a little power, and have kept my word, and have not denied my name." So in the midst of Roman persecution, again, they're a smaller city, kind of in the middle of nowhere. There's not as much of they had their pagan temples around them in their city. They're not that far from Laodicea, which we will look at next week, which was by far my favorite place on the entire trip. Even above Ephesus. You saw Ephesus, how much was there. And it would even rival Athens, I think. Laodicea was to me, was very intriguing. Maybe it was because I just hadn't seen much of it before. But those cities are fairly nearby, you see on the map. So Sardis is not far away. We talked about that last week. Philadelphia, there's Philadelphia. So Laodicea is not too far away. And so it's a little bit down the road from these places, about 27 miles from Sardis. But Philadelphia, it lies in the middle of some of the most fertile plains in this region of modern-day Turkey. And today, the city is called let me see. What is it? Yeah, but I think it's with an SH. Alashahir, I think is how they say it. Which literally means a colorful town. And in the city, they they have intentionally made themselves a colorful town. Buildings are painted in all kinds of different colors, and that was probably too far away to see much of that in that picture. But they live up to the name of the city. Um, as we said, Philadelphia was located on the road there that connects Sardis and Laodicea. So it was a very busy traveled road, but this was not a central stop of any kind. This was kind of, this is flyover country. This is, you just are driving through Philadelphia, at least in ancient times. But even in ancient times, this area was renowned for its vineyards due to this very, very fertile land. And today, this region is known for its grapes that are used to produce raisins. And so you might check next time you buy raisins and see location of where they're from. They may be coming from, if they're coming from Turkey, it's probably around this area. But the soil here, it contains a volcanic ash because of a lot of ancient volcanic eruptions, which is one of the reasons why it's so fertile. But this volcanic activity in this area also causes frequent earthquakes. And it's said that there are as many as 600 earthquakes a day in this part of Turkey, which you don't feel hardly any of them. I don't believe we felt any while we were there. But as far as them measuring them with seismographs and everything, they're able to detect earthquakes happening all the time. And there are still, they still do, and they talk about on a regular basis feeling them. But the ancient historian Strabo, he even commented on how why would anyone want to live in this area? Because it was continuously being shaken by earthquakes. And so it was just known for that in ancient times. But again, the city of Philadelphia, it's like a lot of the other cities that we visited over there. The ancient city has been completely covered with the modern city. And so it's one of the reasons why there's very few remains of the ancient city left, really, if any, in and around Philadelphia. As a matter of fact, most visitors to Philadelphia will only see these three very large pillars from a Christian church that was called St. John's Church. This was built in the 6th century, so the 500s AD. And this area today this is just straight down from above, is an open air museum where the very few artifacts that they have found are on the grounds there. Mostly there's tombstones, there's a few statues, some pillars, things like that. I took a picture of this. It's nothing really that significant, other than the fact that it was found the day before we got there. And so there was damage that was done to this pathway. You walk into this right here. We walked down, and they had the pathway right here torn up, and they were repairing this pathway, and when they dug down repairing this pathway, they had just found that. Been buried for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And again, I've talked about that before. It's just life in Turkey and Greece. It's start digging in your backyard, and who knows what you find. But that was just kind of, I went back, I even went online to see if there was anything online yet. It's been a few months now of anything about this find, and there's not that I can find anything. And our guide told us, he said, your eyes are the first ones to see this. This hasn't been here very long. And so it was laying in the grass just right here when we walked in. And so I thought that was just kind of interesting. But the remains of this church building, I think it's a reminder of a major change that occurred in that region in about the 13th century. And we here don't do a whole lot of history on Eastern or Western Asia history. And so a lot of times we're not as familiar with it. But, for nearly 1,000 years, this area was under the control of what was known as the Byzantine Empire, which is what followed the Roman Empire. And it had a very, very strong Orthodox Christian culture. And so we know, even study from Scripture, this is a map depicting the Roman Empire at about 117 AD. So just after the time of John and the Revelation, not long after that, this is what the Roman Empire looked like. It's massive. It covered the entire Mediterranean area. And then by 560, this is the Byzantine Empire. This yellow over here is what is left of the Roman Empire, as the Roman Empire now is just completely collapsing. And so now you have what was known as the Byzantine Empire. There's a lot of things that happen at this time. You've got even a split within the church that has taken place. You have the Roman Catholic Church that's centered out of Rome with their pope. And then there's also the Eastern Orthodox Church that began to worship with their center in Constantinople. You see, right up here, which is modern day, that is Istanbul today. And so, but there's a lot of things happening. But the Byzantine, that's when we were in this area. You notice even Greece, over here in Greece, is all in the Byzantine Empire. All of the big ancient church buildings that had been built during this time period, they refer to them as Byzantine churches. And even still today, most of them are Eastern Orthodox. They're not Roman Catholic. They're Eastern Orthodox, which there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. Don't tell them I said that. But it's just another offshoot of pretty much the same thing. But the city of Philadelphia at one point was surrounded by the Muslim armies, as after the Byzantine Empire, from the east, the Muslims came in and began to conquer the land. And so this shows what's known as the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is the empire of the Arabs, of the Muslims. But over time, see, by 1566, you see they were getting close to being what the Roman Empire was at one time. And so this is what's happening in that part of the world. This is what we saw everywhere we went. You had these ancient temples that had been built to Greek gods. And then over time, as the worship of this pagan worship began to fade away, as when Constantine became emperor in about 303, 306 AD, he's converted to Christianity, and that was crazy. A Roman emperor, the guys who were persecuting Christians, and now one of them has been converted to Christianity. Well, then Constantine, he did a lot of things to change it over to make Christianity the empire's state religion. And you were actually persecuted if you weren't a Christian after that point. Kind of a crazy turn of events. Not exactly the way Jesus would have done it, but it's the way Constantine did it. And so as Christianity spread, these massive temples, we talked about one last week there in Sardis, where it at one point was a place where Christians had met and worshiped. There was then behind it a Byzantine church building built later on the same site. Well, in most of these cities, then as time went on, those church buildings, if they were in good shape, the Byzantine church buildings, The Muslims, when they came in with the Ottoman Empire, they'd take those same structures and they would turn them into mosques. And so you would have this history in this one building. You'd walk into a building and you'd say, this looks a lot like a pagan temple. But then they built onto it and done some other things around it and turned it into a church building. And then over time, walls would be plastered and everything would be covered up because there would be all kinds of beautiful paintings. When I show you some things from Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, then you'll see some of this. But the Muslims would come in and completely change them, build their domes on top so that they would turn them into mosques. And so you just have this layer of history over time. And so these empires were a very important part to understanding all of this that was going on. Well, the city of Philadelphia, as I said, at one point was surrounded by Muslim armies. But this little city resisted longer than most cities were able to. As a matter of fact, other cities around them, for the most part, were surrendering and just giving up. But Philadelphia, they actually remained independent as a city for almost 100 years. And being one of the very last cities to fall to the Ottomans right before, in 1390, when the Muslims ultimately took Constantinople and took over the whole area. That was the capital, and that pretty much sealed the end of Christianity being the free religion in the nation of Turkey, which even still today, I show you in these pictures, like there. So you can barely see behind. There's those three big columns back there in the back. Here, this is a mosque, just right across the street from it. So they would build either on top of the site or right next to it, they would build a mosque. This is the minaret of the mosque, and you can see, let me back up to that other picture. You can see these minarets. There's one there, there's one there, there's two there, there's one there. You can see there's one right there. You can see them. They're all over. They're like churches in America. There's church buildings all over. They're little. And the size of them has to do with how wealthy the person is that built the mosque. And it also has to do with who they have had come and visit their mosque. And it depends on how many minarets they build and all that. It's all a status thing, but it's very significant to the Muslims. Yeah. In Philadelphia, you said 49? 49 mosques in Philadelphia. So, like I said, it's kind of like us walking down and seeing different church buildings of different kinds, and there are different denominations of Muslims as well. They don't all believe exactly the same things. And so, but Philadelphia, as we said, it lasted longer than most. And this history, even though it's over 1,000 years after the letter to the church in Philadelphia had been written, it's important because it says a lot about the people who live there. And so these three pillars of this Byzantine church building, they still standing in the middle of a city, they're seen as a symbol of what Jesus said to these Christians at the end of his letter here in Revelation 3. In Revelation 3 and verse 10, Jesus says, "Because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I also will keep you from the hour of testing, that hour which is about to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth." Drop down to verse 12. He says, "He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it anymore. And I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name." And so what did this image mean to the Christians in the city at that time when it was written to them? Well, the events that happened in Philadelphia just a few years before the book of Revelation was written gives us some understanding of how relevant these things Jesus says really are to these people. Now, all of this stuff with that church building being built, that was hundreds of years later. And so that didn't have anything to do with why Jesus was writing what he was writing. But there were events that happened not long before this letter was written that may give us a little bit more understanding. And it was a disastrous event that left its mark on everybody who lived there. In 17 AD, there was a very strong earthquake that completely devastated the cities all throughout Western Turkey. Many cities were completely destroyed. Philadelphia was one of them. Sardis was one of them. And many of the others around that area were in really bad shape. Well, the emperor Tiberius at that time, he sent aid to these cities so that all of these cities could be rebuilt. And so, and you think about 17 AD, that's in we're looking at 10 to 15 years before Jesus and his ministry. And so Jesus is alive in Jerusalem as a young man during this time. So that's timeline. That's when this is happening. As Tiberius, though, he wanted to rebuild these cities. And the Roman Empire was usually pretty good at this. They would offer to cities to be rebuilt. We're going to talk about this next week again, this same earthquake and this same disaster when it comes to Laodicea, because it's a completely different story with Laodicea as to what they do with it. But these cities also, the emperor had made to where they were exempt from taxes for 5 years so that they could help them to recover financially. And again, Strabo, the historian that I mentioned a little bit ago, he noted that because of the earthquakes, the walls of the city of Philadelphia were constantly cracking and having to be repaired. And he talks about how people had to flee the city because of the earthquakes, and that they were afraid to go back to their homes because of all the aftershocks. And so this was an ongoing issue in the city of Philadelphia. But instead of rebuilding after the earthquakes, part of the population of the city of Philadelphia chose to live in tents outside of the city. And so this was an indication that they were very insecure about going back and rebuilding, and is it worth rebuilding? And so it's thought that this may have been part of the reason behind Jesus using the image of a pillar there in Revelation 3 and verse 12, which is a symbol of stability. This pillar that Jesus talks about, he says it's a pillar in the temple of God. I will make you a pillar in the temple of God. God places those who are faithful to him as pillars in his house. And so this is something that gives confidence that nothing can shake us. Nothing can move us. We can't be removed from here. And so this symbolism, it would have had some meaning to anyone who lived in the city of Philadelphia. And even more so for the church. Because the church knew that it rested on an unshakable foundation. That foundation of Jesus. Now, that's kind of speculation as to why Jesus used the image of a pillar. I think something that is definitely more likely is that there was also a practice. We're going to see this more next week in Laodicea as well. But in this part of the region that involved engraving the names of people on the columns of the temples to the pagan gods. And in Laodicea, there are massive pillars that are all over still, and every single one of them have this, where there are names that are etched and all up and down these columns. And this was a way for men to be remembered as to how they impacted the city. These were important people. Usually it had to do with how much money did they give. We kind of do the same thing today, don't we? Give enough money to a college, you might get a building with your name on it or something. And so I told the guys at Oklahoma Christian, there have been about 12 of us Shinnerers go through Oklahoma Christian. I said, there should at least be a name on a bathroom stall somewhere. At least. I might have been able to afford that. But these names, again, of the elite of the city, and some of them were also the names of the priests that were working in these pagan temples, and city government leaders. But these are all etched into these pillars. And so the thing is that Christians, of course, are never going to get their names written on pillars like this. Christians were not aspiring for status. They weren't aspiring for fame like other people in the city who devoted their whole lives to being able to have their names written on these pillars. It may have been a lifelong effort just to live your life in a certain way for the city and for the Roman Empire or for that God in that temple, or in some way to, before you die, have your name etched so it would be there forever. And we'll say forever. It's been there a long time. The names are still there, thousands of years later. But the letter to the church in Philadelphia, as we saw there, listen again to verse 12. Notice what Jesus says to them. See, they see these pillars with these names every day. He said, he who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it anymore. And I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name. Clearly, Jesus is making an analogy to something that they see every day. With the names being written on pillars. Whose names are written on pillars? The most important, the most prominent names. Well, whose name is going to be written on them? He says, first of all, I'm going to make you a pillar. And then I'm going to write my name on you. You're going to belong to me. I am the most prominent. I am the most important. But you are important enough for me to be able to put my name on you. And so how significant that would have been to these Christians, just the imagery of what the culture that they lived in. The letter to the church in Philadelphia was a tribute to their never-ending faithfulness. And the promise of having their names written on a pillar in God's temple, God's name written on that pillar, would have been one of the greatest motivations for them to continue to remain faithful in that pagan world that they lived in. And so this church, that was the most insignificant, in a very insignificant city, it was probably a very small, insignificant church compared to many of the other churches in the area. It was the most, it was the one that Jesus honors the most. And so, do you have to be big to be honored by Christ? Do you have to be influential in the whole world of Christendom to be honored by Christ? Now, as a matter of fact, most of those other churches that were massive in big cities and had a big name and importance in a lot of different ways, that even the church in Rome looked upon those churches as being very important, and they're the ones that we see Jesus, as he writes to them, saying, you've messed up. You've lost your first love. You've forgotten where you started. There's a lot of things that they, because their focus had shifted. It might be a blessing to be a church that is still one that is in that small community, to be able to say we still have our focus on the right things. And that's really what we see here in Philadelphia.